Hello, my name is Ildiko,
And I'm Phil.
and this is the My Open Source Experience podcast.
Open source is an incredibly social art.
Open source is innovation.
Open source is enabling.
Open source is community.
And open source is weird.
Open source is incredibly important.
Open source is hard.
Open source is engaging.
Open source is collaboration.
Open source is like running the show.
Open source is ubiquitous.
Open source is, well, my life.
And open source is not free.
Before we dive in, let me give you some important reminders. People on the podcast participate as individuals. They do not represent any company or organization. All the thoughts and opinions are theirs. People share their stories and experiences, the way how they went through them and how they remember them, and reflect how those experiences affected their lives, influenced their decisions and their careers back then or ever since. Welcome to the My Open Source Experience podcast. In today's episode, Phil and I are talking to Allison Randal, and we are touching on topics from both community as well as corporate perspective. We are talking about what communities as well as companies can do to make onboarding a better experience for newcomers. We're also talking about corporate roles and how they translate to roles within open source projects. Or do they? And we're talking about how we are using the language that we are speaking, or in other words, how to talk to corporate management about open source. Are we contributing, or are we rather investing in the open source project that we are also relying on? And many more topics. Enjoy the show. Allison, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself, your tech background, and what do you do now?
I don't know how far back you want to go. So I started programming when I was about 8 with my dad, making games, video games. It's just a fun thing to do together. But I didn't really think of it as a career option. I thought of it more like you think of like a hobby. So I didn't really think of it as, oh, this is what I do want to do with my life. This is going to be my job. It was just a fun thing. It was like, reading a book or something, or painting a picture, or I don't know. So I actually did linguistics rather than computer science in college. Partly my dad took me through a lot of master's level computer science textbooks in high school, and I just thought it would be boring to do computer science again in college. But anyway, my first career was actually linguistics. So East Africa, language research, traveling around in Land Rovers and avoiding landmines. So what I found was that I was having more fun doing the computer programming around linguistic research. So, data analysis and cleaning up data sets and stuff like that. I was having more fun with that than I was with the actual linguistic research. And there were also medical reasons I ended up having to leave Africa. I had back problems. So I shifted careers when I did, I already had this Perl experience. So I just went to a startup that was using Perl for their online bookseller website. And that was kind of like where it got started as a professional techie, as opposed to just a hobbyist techie.
Did you find that studying and researching linguistics that kind of fed into your tech career in any way?
Very directly, in fact, because programming languages are languages. So they're human languages, even. In fact, most of them are English languages. They're a bit more formalized and structured, but they are language. And the way humans' brains relate to it is very much the way that we relate to other language, which is interesting.
That's very interesting. I know that programming languages are technically called languages, but I never really thought of them in a way like how humans talk to each other. Just like the computer brain was always kind of different for me.
Yeah, the computer doesn't actually read all that English stuff you write. Like you have to like change all that into a completely different shape that the computer understands. The computer doesn't read that stuff. That all that English stuff you type, the code, is actually for other programmers. Like that's the point, and for yourself. Like so, when you come back and look at it later, you understand what on earth you were trying to do. So yeah, it's weird. Like you don't think of it. Like you think of it as, oh, I'm just trying to tell the computer what to do. But actually, it has this whole extra language function to it.
That's so cool. I remember, I think it was the first place where I worked where we had this like, I think there was a trend at that time about clean code, and your code should be like well-written prose, and people had like really religious debates about how that clean code is supposed to look like. So that is very funny how these languages have also like the social aspect to it, and what it brings out of people too. There were like really heated debates about it.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I remember many times being told about how elegant Lisp was and how everything should actually just be written in Lisp.
I'm curious where you first learned about open source. Was it even called open source at the time when you first got in touch with it?
No, it was. We didn't come up with the name open source until later. But so I mentioned that startup I was working at where I was using my Perl experience. So I went. I taught Perl at the local Linux user group, and that was kind of where I first got sort of in touch with the community. First hanging out with them, and then kind of teaching a class there. But then I went to this Perl conference, and I met Larry and Gloria Wall. Larry Wall was the creator of Perl, and Larry and Gloria, in addition to being just absolutely wonderful people, also had a background in linguistics. And they suggested I get involved in the Perl project itself. Specifically, Larry invited me to join the design team for a new version of the language. So I did. It wasn't like I didn't have any consciousness of making a big step. It was just, oh, this looks interesting. I'll do this for a while. But then, so I was involved in the design team, and then I was project manager for Perl, and then I was president of the Perl Foundation, and then chief architect of a project called Parrot, which was like an implementation of Perl and Python and Ruby and PHP and like dynamic languages in general. So it just kind of like, it started with nothing more than a casual, someone who was involved was kind enough to have a conversation with me and suggest, hey, you should think about getting involved. And that was really all it took.
So I assume that that we can say that your first experience was a nice and good experience in that community and then in that environment, right?
It was, yeah. It was a very positive experience.
What was the time frame?
90s, 2000s, kind of. Okay. I was on the board of the Perl Foundation until, I think, 2017. So a long time, but I was not involved in Perl development anymore. At that point, I was just serving on the board still.
So when you were invited to get involved, like how long did it take for you to realize that this is something that you will stay involved in? Like what made you stay?
It was never a thing where I was like, all right, I'm committed. I'm going to do this for 50 years. It's always been a thing that it's just, the people are great. So having good people to work with is a big deal. The interesting problems to solve, like my brain likes puzzles. So like, it's always like a little stubbornness of curiosity for like the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And also like a sense of making progress on that problem you're trying to solve. Like, it gives you this satisfaction that, this was worthwhile. And then when you can also see it having an impact on technology as a whole or society, or you can see those extra impacts, that's also helps too, because you feel like you're using your time for something that's important, it's valuable, that matters.
And you were also involved in other projects and communities as well, and being on the board of other foundations. Can you mention a few examples?
So the Perl, Python, Debian, Ubuntu, OpenStack would be like the really big ones. A bunch of others, but either I made smaller contributions to them, like Linux, only a very tiny amount, or Linux kernel, I mean, only a very tiny amount, or others, like you wouldn't recognize the name if you heard it anyway. So it's like, I spent years on Parrot, but like, usually it's people who are like compilers, people know what Parrot is, and other people are like, what? What's that? It wasn't, the name didn't catch on. Only the name Perl remains as recognizable. Bunch of things over the years. Some technical, some leadership, both technical leadership and management type leadership, and then some more like, executive board and like president, chair of the board, things like that as well. Sort of a mixture of hats.
To spin the conversation around, I wanted to touch on things a little bit from community perspective, because you participated in various communities. So I wanted to ask about how your onboarding experience was. Like, was it always a nice experience to show up at a new community and start to get involved? Like, did you have mentors, or did you also have some rocky experiences of like, this involvement is driven by my job, I need to find a way in, but like I'm finding kind of closed doors or not having a nice experience trying to start to participate?
I don't think I've ever participated in a community that had a really good onboarding experience. I've never worked for a company that had a really good onboarding experience either. I think there is a certain amount of inherent difficulty in getting it started in any new thing, and no one who's been doing it for a long time is ever going to be really good at helping you get started. I have had some, I would say, not mentors in the sense of here's how you do this, here's how you do that, more in the sense of being encouraging. I mean, answering questions when you have them, but just kind of encouraging you to try new things and do new things. I think I've had that. A lot of it is just a very stubborn streak of curiosity. Like just keep poking at things and poking at things and poking at things. And then suddenly it all makes sense. It's almost like I'm loading a file into my brain one line at a time. And then when you reach the 50,000 lines mark, suddenly magically the pattern clicks and it all makes sense. And I've had that experience on multiple different projects over time. So it's become a pattern. And I don't know if it's just the way I learn. I am very much a pick up a textbook and read through it cover to cover to learn something. I'm very much a self-driven learner. So I don't know if it's just me, but that has been my experience at every new community that I've joined. I will say what makes a big difference is the sort of kindness versus hostility to new people. Sure, I'm going to find my own way. I'm going to learn my own thing. But if everybody around me is like hostile to each other and to me all the time, chances are, and it has happened, I will just leave before I bother learning, before I bother loading the file fully into my head. I'm like, just, not worth it. Even if it's my job, just leave that job. That is not a good place to be. No. And I've had that experience in corporate environments as well as open source communities. Like there are some companies that are just no. It does help to have better documentation. That does help. And documentation beyond I see a lot of projects that they have like a really nice clear document that's here's how you install it for the first time. Like after that, it descends into chaos. I think there is a lot of room for helping. So documenting your contribution process is one of them. You know, like if I can just go read through the doc, even if it's a complicated process, you know, involving new software for code reviews I've never used before, if the steps are outlined in an easy to follow way, that means I can just do it on my own and get it pretty much right the first time. So that definitely helps. It helps to have architecture documents. So not just here's how you install it, here's what it does, but like here's how we designed it and why. And even like little notes of like the why, the historical whys can be really helpful and save the developers a lot of time repeating themselves over and over again to outsiders saying, no, it's that way because, no, it's that way because. We need to explain it in one place and kind of point people to it. And honestly, writing down why it is that way, a lot of times you will find, wait, why is it that way? That's like, okay, we made that decision 10 years ago because of this and this, but that makes no sense whatsoever. So it's not just valuable for newcomers, it's actually valuable for you as a community to take the time to kind of think through things at that level.
When it comes to the onboarding experience, it's kind of as much about the process and documentation as it is about the people. So if a community doesn't have the resources, then it's obviously a lot of pressure on the people to onboard someone, versus you can have all the documentation, but if the environment is not great, then people will not get through it anyway. So it's kind of a balance between those two.
There's another factor. So for me, every project I've ever been involved in has had some element of scratching my own itch. It's had some element of I used it personally or I used it professionally, or there was a reason I was involved. So it can be tempting to think that if you're not getting new contributors, that it's the fault of the documentation or the fault of the onboarding process or the fault of something you're doing wrong. But in actual fact, it has to do with the motivation of the contributor. And a really motivated contributor will push through even toxic behavior. A contributor who is not motivated to work on your particular project will not do it, even if you make it as easy as possible. And there's also a domain, how easy it is to get involved can also have a lot to do with how complicated the technology is. And that isn't necessarily that the technology is unnecessarily complicated. It could just be you're solving a really complicated problem, like managing clouds. That is a really complicated problem. And the knowledge that you need to effectively contribute to a project like that is huge. It's not like contributing to a little JavaScript library that generates random numbers or something, you know, like just about anybody can do that, do a drive-by contribution, and it is valuable. It takes it's not rocket science, but it takes a much higher degree of expertise to successfully, to wrap your head around the domain of knowledge necessary to make a good contribution to an infrastructure project. And it's like layers and layers of knowledge. Like you kind of need to understand the hardware that you're running on and the Linux kernel and the operating system and then the way you network connect the compute machines and the storage machines and then, you know, like orchestration best practices and, you know, like there's these tiers and tiers of knowledge. So I think having sympathy for the fact that there may be a massive hurdle long before the person even looks at your mailing list. Like the reason they're not there could have nothing to do with your project. Honestly, I think there might be room for teaching more of those concepts, more of the concepts rather than just the code. Because I don't think kids come out of college. I don't think people come out of their work experience necessarily having that. You know, you don't go get a certification in this kind of expertise. So, yeah, I don't know how, but I don't know, a series of YouTube videos teaching the fundamentals of cloud computing, you know? I've been thinking about that for hardware design, because modern hardware design, even though we're shifting more into open silicon, open hardware, actually the way you learn modern hardware design is you go work for Intel or ARM or AMD. You work for a company that does it, and then you absorb their knowledge, and then you become an expert. But at the same time, that means you're baked in with their biases from 70 years of the way they've done hardware engineering, and some of it's terrible. Like, some of it is absolutely terrible, and they should not be doing things that way anymore. But no one's teaching any other way, and there's no way to gain that knowledge.
Did you find these projects through like your day job, if like you were contributing on behalf of a company, or were most of these projects like personal interest or a combination?
Mixture. The first job I had that I was actually hired to work on open source was Ubuntu. So I took a job at Canonical where I was explicitly hired to be technical architect of Ubuntu. And that wasn't until the late 2000s. So like for a long time, it really was volunteer on the side, mostly because I used the project in some way, either personally or professionally or a mixture of the two. But I have since then had jobs where, like I worked at Hewlett Packard. I was employed to work on OpenStack and manage a team of people who worked on OpenStack. So I've had cases, when I was at SUSE, obviously we worked on SUSE. That's what we worked on. We worked on a Linux distro. So I guess it's been a mixture of the two, and you kind of get different experiences with both. I mean, like, maybe it's because of the way I started, but I always feel a little bit more comfortable when I'm just a volunteer. Like when there's not money involved, I feel like it simplifies your motivations in some way. It's like you can totally and completely focus on what you think is technically best, or best for the community, or best for the project, or best for society, or I don't know. It's like more like volunteering for a soup kitchen. It is more straightforward in many ways. You know what you're there for. You don't have to balance different factors. On the other hand, I do like earning an income. I suppose everyone does. And there have absolutely been times when I had to devote less energy to a project because I also had to have a paid job on the side, right? So I couldn't focus on the project. And there is a delightful freedom in knowing that your 100% job is working on this project, and you are paid to do it, and somebody cares enough about the project to pay you to do it. And so there's a freedom in that too. Even though it does come with a certain degree of challenges in terms of balancing the interests of different groups. And I suppose one of the things that I would say, one of my master level skills over the years that I grew up, that I did not have at all when I started in the 90s, is this sort of like balance of stakeholders. This sort of like deeply understanding where everyone's coming from and what they're willing to put into it and what they're trying to get out of it. And, kind of like not expecting them to be something else than they are, right? So I'd say early on, there were times when, I kind of expected a community member or a company to be something completely different than it was. And I found over time that it helps me enormously to kind of like approach it from the Zen mindset of, okay, deeply understand who you're dealing with, why they're there, what they want, what they are willing to give, what they aren't, and then kind of figure out how to use that ball of things to the best advantage, whatever that is. And sometimes it's help them understand how, well, if they really want this thing, they're going to have to be willing to give a little bit more than this thing over here. If they're not willing to give enough to get what they want out of it, you need to help them draw that line between, no, actually, you need to give a little bit, you need to give this, or it may not be a little bit more, it may be a little bit differently. You need to participate in just this little bit different way, and then you'll get more what you need out of it. With companies, that often comes down to, okay, you are using a project in your business or shipping a project as a product, and you come to it thinking, oh, I'll just get open source for free, and great, now I have it, and that's the end of it. And it will just magically keep coming and appearing, and over time it will continue to appear and work, and like I don't have to give anything, or I give like a small donation at a conference or something. I'd say that mindset is much less common now, but like in the 2000s, that was a very common mindset. So I can just like consume and it's fine, it'll all be good, it's magic, it's like trees, it just keeps growing forever. So sometimes it's a matter of, well, if you want a nice, stable, reliable project, what you need to give is people to do the work. Like, not all the people. You're not responsible for all the work like you would be if it was an in-house project. But if this is the thing you want to get, a stable, reliable, open source project that you can ship as a product or use within your infrastructure or within your products, then what it needs is this. It needs this investment. To get what you want, you need to invest this. And that sounds kind of mechanical, but like sometimes reducing it to that level where you can like explain it that way actually really helps. Or if, an individual comes in and what they want out of the open source project is a job, well, that's great, but people are going to hire you for doing work on this project if you're not really doing anything useful, or there's a give and a take to everything.
You've touched upon a couple of things there. I think the soft skills that a developer requires to be able to have the empathy in what all the stakeholders are trying to get out of it and what they're willing to put into it, and having the ability to find the compromise path between them all, I personally consider one of the prime master level skills of a good open source developer beyond their technical competence. And those are typically the folks that rise in ranks, and because they build that trust, they know that everybody understands that this person understands what I'm trying to do and what I'm willing to give to get there. In my experience, they kind of rise to that. Would you agree with that? And can you think of any specific examples where you've seen that, particularly with yourself or with others?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is totally fine to just be technical and nothing else. Like, there is definitely room for people who are just really good at technology. Not if they're toxic. I think that's problematic. It causes a lot of problems. But if you're just really good at technology and you're happy to just do that, that's fine. You don't need to rise to a leadership rank. It is okay. But I think there is also an enormous amount of value in people who can take that next step up. And I do think empathy, you mentioned empathy, is a big thing. I mean, I think Larry Wall is an example of a person who I would consider highly empathetic, a very open communicator, very open-minded about people and what they're capable of and what to expect of them, and encouraging them to step up where they can. And I think that was a key part of the early days' success of the project. I think it was just a very different way of approaching people and software. And I've certainly seen it since then. Teddy Carrez, who's a person that I worked with, he was one of the early folks in OpenStack. He was someone I worked with at Canonical too. He was actually one of my interviewers at Canonical, when I first took the job. I think he's someone he's interesting because he is a leader who has always declined to be recognized as a leader. He's like always kind of downplayed, not the benevolent dictator type at all. And that, I think, has made him more effective over the decades, because what he really cares about is getting things done and getting them done well, and people being effective and working together well, and the philosophy of the four opens, like doing things the right way. And I think there are a lot of examples of people like that out there who, they may not be famous. they may not get newspaper splashes, and they're okay with that. But they have a really positive impact on groups of people getting things done together.
I think when it comes to the community side, like you have those people and they show the example and like lead by example. Now on the corporate side, I'm kind of curious what it took to learn how to learn about the stakeholders and how to balance them, because I do personally have the experience of being loud enough to make a name and voice of myself inside the company where I worked previously, and then I think I can say it out loud that I failed miserably when it comes to talking to leadership, balancing stakeholders, and not because I said anything that was not true, but I didn't find the way to help people with the 100% corporate mindset to understand what I'm talking about, because they didn't have the open source experience. So when you talk about the values of open source, when you talk about that it's much more than just free software, when you talk about why not to fork something, or like why it is a bad idea to make changes in the middle of an open source project and not contribute it back. And even when the company made the mistake previously in a different project and they are doing it again and not realizing that they are doing the same thing, I still was not successful to tell them why it's not going to work. Like if you're doing the same thing, you will get the exact same outcome, no questions asked. And tried to explain it so many ways and didn't go through. And I was talked to in a not very nice way inside the corporate environment. I don't know if I would have been talked to the same way if I wasn't at that time young Hungarian woman. Maybe it would have been a little bit different, but at the same time, this balancing of stakeholders and balancing the open source and the corporate hat, because what the corporation wanted, I wasn't always comfortable bringing that to the community, because if you ruin your own trust, then you can't get anything done on from the practical perspective. And on the human side of things, like if something is not compatible with my own values, I'm not going to represent that, no matter whether or not it's part of the paid job. So like you push back, obviously, but it's really hard to push back in the corporate environment. And I do have the experience of how to fail, but I don't think I was able to get enough experience to figuring it out, how to actually make it work.
So my weird background is relevant here because I studied linguistics and anthropology before I got involved in open source. So one of the things that we do extensively is both understanding that different communities use different languages, and even if they're both English, like legal English is completely different than, like bikers English is completely different than, football players English is, like there's subsets of vocabulary. And then understanding the anthropology is kind of like extensive training in like realizing that people are coming from different contexts. They have a completely different bubble of background knowledge. Even though they may be using the same words, they may understand them completely differently. And sort of developing the skills to be like, one of the things we did is they just dropped us in with a Maasai tribe for 6 weeks to live with them and, kind of like figure out how to survive in a it's not just survive, but thrive and make friends and like in a completely different cultural context with completely different background and completely different, like just like from scratch. It's like a really good way of challenging your assumptions. So when I got into open source, I already had that background and that's what I brought into it. So I would say one of the first things you're dealing with there is a language clash. So what the company is saying and what the community is saying. So they might actually be saying the same thing. The way the company said it is completely different than the way the community said it. And you sitting there, you're constantly translating between the two because you have to learn both dialects. And you're constantly, when the company says something and you're like, oh no, that, I can't say that. You kind of have to break it down linguistically and anthropologically and figure out what is it that they're actually trying, like what is it they actually need here? What do they care about? What do they not? Like, I know they said that thing, but is that actually what they meant? And I kind of like break it down to its like spare part, like base components. And then what you say to the community is what actually matters in a way the community can actually understand. And you may even have to explain some background about, oh, well, we had this customer and they had this problem. This is like actually help the community understand, and vice versa. Like sometimes you find yourself to the company explaining, oh, well, this is what this project has been through before, and this is why this matters, and this is why that matters, and this is like why that particular thing won't work in here. So part of it is just a translation. Part of it is also really fundamentally anthropology. It's like you're dealing with alien tribes from another planet who just do not understand the other. And once you realize that, it actually helps. When you realize that, like I don't really feel like I'm part of corporate culture. Sometimes I don't even feel like I'm part of the community culture. Sometimes I do. It depends on the community. Different communities I feel more or less at home in. But just kind of like, I don't know, doing that cultural analysis and kind of like understanding how the system functions and what the values are and how those values work and where they break down. And, like that really helps. So I kind of had all of that, and that got me through at least a decade. And then another thing that I found really helpful was, as part of my master's degree, I did some straight up business technical strategy and management courses. And the reason that helped is not because I learned anything new. It's because I did the courses using all open source projects as my examples. The professors thought that was great because all my work was like a field they didn't know anything about. But I basically took all the business words and explained open source projects in those business words. It's just words. It's just language, right? But like sort of like I was like doing a translation error exercise as a business assignment, business class assignment. And that I found really helped me kind of level up in terms of how well I was able to explain things to companies. Because a lot of it, like even using the word stakeholders, I never would have used the word stakeholders before. All stakeholders means is people who care about a thing or have an interest in it or need something out of it, or there's a lot like, but it's like a shorthand that like, you find the right word, then people sometimes like people with a somewhat corporate background can like that one word encapsulates a huge amount of knowledge, and then you can say things much more quickly and easily in a way that they will understand. So I found that really helpful.
Is your thesis available somewhere? I would love to read it.
It is. My master's thesis was actually on OpenStack. It was on OpenStack community collaboration values. That's what I did a survey across OpenStack companies involved in OpenStack around what mattered to them and like sort of what their values were and what sort of things they were doing to improve their participation or like get more value out by putting more value in, sort of like all those like concepts.
So there were companies in OpenStack that OpenStack was clearly their first experience in open source. In my experience, part of that linguistic and anthropologic issue is one of bias, right? Again, you use a particular term or you talk about a particular thing. Oh, well, that's just like this. Well, it's kind of like this, but here's the way it's different. And you have to really care about those nuances and differences. One such example for me is that of relating open source projects to standards activities. Lots of similarities.
Also lots of differences.
But yeah, and one of the big ones that is difficult to describe is, in a lot of corporate structures, you grow as a developer to become an architect, right? And that's the better role. And so you grow out of writing code and into creating PowerPoints, for lack of a better term. And often it's those architects that are part of those standards bodies, and they're the senior leaders and so forth. So trying to explain to a company that you actually can't do that in open source. You can't gain influence by being an architect. That doesn't happen. You gain influence by reviewing other people's code. And to do that, you have to understand the code really, really well. You have to be an architect to be a leader, to be able to say, where are we going? But you have to do it at the code level. And I found companies that is their culture anyway, so they more easily slip into and fit into an open source ecosystem. But there are other companies where that's really a struggle, right? Having an architect on the TSC is the level of control that should be, possible to get what I want out of this project. And it's like,
let me present PowerPoints, and then that sets the direction of the open source project. Yeah.
Have you seen that? And you had to have those conversations with folks? And if so, give me an example or two of that one.
I have seen it. It never works. A lot of it, sometimes it isn't at that level. It isn't at the level of, we have a senior person, they should be on the technical steering committee or the board or whatever. It's not, sometimes it's at that level, or expecting that a board seat means you control the direction of the project. I have seen that. But a lot more of it is, I would say in volume, that's a smaller number of people, because there are a smaller number of people at that level. And the larger number of people making that mistake is, well, I reported a bug, isn't that enough? Or I said something in the early design part, and shouldn't that mean that they implement the thing that I suggested? And not realizing that for every one sentence that you say about design, there are many, many, many human hours of work to make that a reality. And you kind of have to back up. You have to put your money where your mouth is, right? You have to put your implementation work in as advocacy for a direction, the same way you have to put in, contribute, like, this is how we're using it, this is how it affects us. Or the way I often put it, to try to be a little bit more concrete, is, if you just participate at the level of talking about what you need, you are only going to get a little bit of value back out of that. Like, if that's the only thing you put in, you're only going to get a little bit of value back out. And as you get more and more involved into, actually putting in coding time, like, you are going to get more value out of that. Like, the work will serve your needs better and serve your customers' needs better. And also, because you're doing it in collaboration with a bunch of people, the whole project will serve everyone's needs better because of that work that you did. So it's kind of like, I talk about it as tiers of participation. Like, as you get more deeply engaged in the work of the project, you get more value out of it. And it's a worthwhile investment of your time and your developers' time to make the project better.
Yeah, that leads to something else that you had said that I wanted to touch upon, which was having people contribute. I need this feature. I want something out of this project. I'm willing to participate, and I want to give this feature. And that's me participating. I'm helping the project. I'm adding features to the project. And while that's a true statement, there's an overhead with that feature, and that is the review. And we see maintainer burnout as a topic because, particularly in really popular projects, and OpenStack was a poster child for this problem, of too few people doing reviews and being able to have the expertise to do that. Versus the number of blueprints and number of submissions that they were getting on any given release, that the backlog was significant. So the next step after contributing something is again, if you want to help the project sustain, you start to do reviews. And that also builds influence because in the end, if you're a good reviewer and you understand a significant amount of the code base, you're often invited to be a committer. And that gains influence. That makes it easier for you to help your company get other features in because you know the dialect of the project, you know what they're after.
It also helps you in a much more direct way, which is like if you have people reviewing patches, you can catch things that are going to be a problem long before they hit you.
Exactly.
There's been a lot of talk lately about XZ, and oh no, there was this, actually malicious committer like pushing in over time harmful changes. It's like, well, the answer to that is to have all of the companies, depending on that project, have code reviewers in the project early on. That's the way you
plus
fix
one,
that.
negative one. No, what's going on? Don't have to be a committer to actually have a voice. Exactly.
Yeah, and not just saying it, but actually like running the code, trying it out, poking at it from a security perspective, and yeah.
So here's the interesting rub. Those architects who have the time to do standards work and so forth, they're not in the same group as the product developers who have 15 engineers trying to get those features out the door. Part proprietary often and part open source. And because they're in that group of, I need to get this thing out the door, I have this tight deadline, they don't have time to do reviews. So again, it ties back into you have a corporate structure that says that when you become a senior developer and you should be gaining influence in the company, you do it as an architect and you have influence in the internal network of professionals, developers within your organization. But to successfully be influential in that technology out in the world, you have to be able to do those reviews. And corporate structures, again, when they're not built to support that, it's back to the anthropomorphic problem of, here's an entire cultural structure that isn't really built to optimize for open source. And so it's a much bigger cultural change, right? And clearly I've thought about this for a long time, right? And trying to pick this apart into these analogies. And again, I know you've been around forever as well. So again, any experiences there, and does that thought process ring true to you? Have you thought it in those terms? And
it absolutely does. The way I often put it is are you as a company rewarding your developer, your engineers, for their participation in the open source project? Like, do you recognize when they have done such good reviews that they become a core reviewer? Do you recognize that? Is that part of your review packet for promotions? Is there status external? And I don't mean it in like a blanket way, like I've had companies say, oh, we're number one in terms of hiring project leaders and such as, like, that's not meaningless metrics, but actually meaningful metrics, for your engineers developing their careers in the company. Make sure you recognize that community recognition of their technical expertise. Make sure you build that into your process. And it does happen on like a sporadic basis. Like I was hired into Hewlett Packard as a distinguished engineer. Hewlett Packard does not hire people as distinguished engineers. You have to work your way up through the tiers. So they hired me at that level based on my open source experience. So they looked at my resume, all the projects I've been, leaders of, the boards I've served on, and like all of this. So they actually considered my open source experience in finding the right level for me and the company. And that is something that every company should be doing. Like if you aren't like asking for a section of open source experience from your engineers who have some involvement in open source, you're not actually fully recognizing your employees. You're not really appreciating them for what they've achieved.
Yep. And I'd even go so far as to say that even companies the size of Hewlett Packard, you had pockets of cluefulness and the ability to do that, whereas other pockets, probably not so much.
Yes. Yeah. I stumbled on a good pocket. And that's true. I think that's true of a lot of companies. Like, I would never say that any company is entirely clueful or entirely clueless, but every company has clueful people and clueless people all jumbled up inside together.
before we depart, Allison, can you tell us something about yourself that has nothing to do with tech and nothing to do with open source?
So I like real paintings. That is not an original, but it is real paint that someone kindly made for me. It's an homage to an original. I used to be a painter when I was young. I haven't had time to paint in decades, but I still like real paintings. And I collect swords. There's a katana on that wall, and there's a bat'leth on that wall, which you don't see. They're art more than anything else, but they're like art with a purpose. There's like a form and function to them that I find appealing in kind of the same way I do with code. You know, it's like beautiful, and also it achieves a thing at the same time.
When you were painting, did you have like a particular style, or like were you painting like oil or watercolor?
Yeah, acrylic and pencil were my two main mediums. I like acrylic because it dries fairly quickly, but at the same time it's pretty malleable and mixable. But not any particular style. I mean, like I went through the whole, like, you do landscapes, you do like still lives, you do like horses and chipmunks and like animals and like whatever. It's like, I don't know, all that stuff. I never really particularly developed any unique style of my own. I was not a great artist. I was just a hobbyist.
Was there a basis for the sword collection? I mean, that's a little bit eclectic, right? So how did that come about?
It started in Africa. So
Okay.
Maasai swords, Maasai spears, just sort of like, it was something like interesting culturally that was not just like a pop or something like that.
Right.
And there was something like, there's often like a culture, an anthropology around particular blades as well, and the way they're used. You know, like the katana has this whole complex cultural tradition behind it. So there was like some of that too, but it was in a sense just, I accidentally noticed over time that I had collected a lot of things with blades and, you know, was learning about museum preservation of metals and stuff. And then I realized, oh, I'm a sword collector. Okay. But it was very accidental. It just sort of like accumulated.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave your thoughts and feedback in the comments section of the platform where you're following the podcast. This season is full of very interesting topics. For instance, open source licenses, culture within communities as well as companies, mentorship programs, open source within companies, or in other words, why does HR have to know what free and open source software is? Stay tuned because the next episode is just around the corner.
That was my first experience.
Oh, I loved it. Y'all had me telling stories that I haven't even thought about. And
Thank you so much for having me here. It was a pleasure.
Like, I will have coffee with the two of you any day for the rest of my life. Like,